3 months after the newspaper story broke, the annual HOA meeting took place in a completely different atmosphere. The community center was packed again, but this time with purpose rather than chaos. Gerald Hayes was not present, having resigned under pressure, and currently awaiting trial on multiple criminal charges. Greg Palmer had also resigned and taken a plea deal to testify against Gerald in exchange for reduced charges. The remaining board members were a mix of newly elected representatives, chosen in a special election that had seen record turnout. Marcus sat in the audience with Linda Cruz on one side and Henry Martinez on the other. The alliance had grown to include 23 families and had become a permanent organization advocating for ranching interests in the community. They had successfully pushed for changes to the HOA, bylaws that protected agricultural properties from arbitrary enforcement and required transparency. In all board financial dealings, the new HOA president was Helen Murphy, a retired teacher who had lived in the community for 40 years. She had run on a platform of reform and accountability. As she called the meeting to order, her voice was calm but firm. This would be a very different kind of meeting than the ones Gerald Hayes had run. "Good evening, everyone," Helen began. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We have important business to conduct, but first I want to acknowledge what this community has been through over the past few months. We've learned hard lessons about the importance of oversight and accountability. We've seen what happens when power is concentrated in the hands of people who abuse it for personal gain." She paused and looked directly at the alliance members. "We've also seen the courage it takes to stand up against injustice. Many people in this room risked their homes and livelihoods to expose corruption. I want to thank them publicly for their service to this community." The room erupted in applause. Marcus felt Linda Cruz squeeze his hand. He looked around and saw tears on many faces. These were people who had felt powerless for years and who had found strength in unity. Helen continued with the agenda, covering routine HOA business with a level of transparency that had never existed before. Financial reports were presented in detail with questions welcomed. Enforcement procedures were discussed with input from property owners. Proposed rule changes were debated openly, rather than simply imposed by the board. When they reached the section on old business, Helen pulled out a thick folder. "The board has reviewed all outstanding fines and violations from the previous administration. We've identified multiple cases of improper or excessive enforcement. I'm pleased to announce that we're voiding all fines levied against properties represented by the Rancher Alliance. Additionally, we're refunding amounts that were already paid under duress." More applause filled the room. Carlos Rodriguez stood up. "What about the families who were forced to sell their properties? What happens to them?" Helen nodded seriously. "That's a more complex issue. The civil lawsuit filed by the Alliance is still pending. The board has authorized a settlement fund of $500,000 to compensate those families. We're also working with the district attorney to ensure that Mountain Vista Development faces consequences for their role in the scheme." Paul Sherman, the Alliance lawyer, stood to address the meeting. "I want to update everyone on the legal proceedings. Gerald Hayes is facing 8 felony counts, including fraud and theft. His trial is scheduled for next month. Roger Hayes from Mountain Vista Development is facing conspiracy charges. Several other individuals, including Kyle Morris, are facing charges related to property vandalism and intimidation." He smiled slightly. "I should mention that the video evidence of the Mailbox attack has been particularly effective in those cases. Watching grown men flee from flashing lights has provided some entertainment value during an otherwise serious process." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew about Marcus's engineered mailbox by now. It had become legendary in the community. Helen moved to the final item on the agenda. "I want to propose a memorial recognition for the families who lost properties due to the previous board's actions. We can't give them back their homes, but we can acknowledge the injustice they suffered and ensure it's never forgotten." The proposal passed unanimously. The meeting adjourned with people lingering to talk in small groups. There was a sense of healing beginning after months of conflict and revelation. Marcus walked out into the cool spring evening with several Alliance members. They stood in the parking lot talking about fence repairs and cattle prices and normal ranching concerns. The crisis had passed and life was slowly returning to normal rhythms. Over the following months, the legal proceedings continued. Gerald Hayes was convicted on 6 counts and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Roger Hayes received a shorter sentence after cooperating with prosecutors. The civil lawsuit settled with the HOA and Mountain Vista Development paying damages to affected families, totaling over $2 million. It would not fully compensate them for what they had lost, but it was something. The HOA implemented sweeping reforms under Helen Murphy's leadership. New bylaws protected agricultural properties from suburban standards. Financial oversight was dramatically increased with quarterly audits and public reporting. Board members were required to disclose all potential conflicts of interest. An independent ombudsman was appointed to handle disputes before they escalated to fines. Most significantly, the ranching families who had been marginalized for years became active participants in HOA governance. Henry Martinez was elected to the board in the next regular election. Carlos Rodriguez joined the Architectural Review Committee, where he could ensure that agricultural needs were considered. Linda Cruz became a vocal advocate at meetings, making sure the board never forgot what had happened. Marcus continued his quiet retirement on his ranch. His cattle thrived, and he enjoyed the peaceful mountain views he had originally come here to find. But he remained involved with the alliance, serving as an advisor when technical or strategic questions arose. He had discovered that retirement did not mean withdrawal from community concerns. One warm afternoon in late summer, Marcus walked down his driveway to collect his mail. The white colonial mailbox stood exactly as it had for months now. Nobody had touched it since that night when Greg Palmer and Kyle Morris tried to destroy it. The wooden exterior showed some weathering, but the structure remained solid. Marcus had added a small bronze plaque to the mailbox post. It read simply, "Built to last," with the date of installation. People driving by sometimes stopped to take photos. The mailbox had become a tourist attraction of sorts, representing the moment when one person's refusal to surrender sparked a larger movement. As Marcus opened the mailbox door to retrieve his mail, he heard a truck approaching. Henry Martinez pulled up and rolled down his window. "Hey Marcus, you got a minute? I want to run something by you about the water rights issue at the next meeting." "Sure, come on up to the house," Marcus said. "I've got fresh coffee brewing." They walked together up the driveway, talking about irrigation schedules and HOA business. Henry's teenage grandson was learning to work cattle, and Marcus had offered to show him some techniques. Normal neighborly conversation between two ranchers on a pleasant afternoon. Inside the house, they sat at Marcus's kitchen table with coffee and discussed the water rights situation. It was a complex issue involving multiple properties and competing interests. Marcus sketched out some ideas on a notepad, showing how engineering principles could help optimize the distribution. Henry nodded along, taking notes. "You know," Henry said after they had worked through the problem, "people used to ask me why I stayed here year after year, putting up with all the harassment from Gerald and his crowd. I stayed because this land has been in my family for 4 generations. But I was starting to think maybe I should just sell and move somewhere easier." He looked at Marcus directly. "You changed that. You showed us that we didn't have to accept being pushed around. That one person standing up could make a difference. I'm grateful for that, Marcus. My grandkids will get to grow up on this ranch because you decided to fight back." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I just built a mailbox, Henry. You and Linda and all the others did the real work of organizing and standing together." "You built more than a mailbox," Henry said. "You built an example. Sometimes that's what people need to find their own courage." After Henry left, Marcus sat alone thinking about the past year. He had come to Colorado seeking peace and had found conflict instead. But through that conflict, he had found purpose and community. The mailbox had been just an engineering project initially, a solution to a practical problem using the skills he had developed over his career. But it had become something more. A symbol of resistance against injustice, a catalyst for change, a reminder that individual action could spark collective movement. Marcus had not set out to become a community organizer or activist. He had just wanted to be left alone to raise cattle in peace. But sometimes peace required fighting for it. Marcus walked through his house and out onto the back porch. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in orange and purple. His cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture. The land stretched out quiet and beautiful in the evening light. Marcus looked around the barn at the faces watching him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. These were hard-working people who had been beaten down by years of harassment. Many of them had already given up on fighting back. Getting them to trust him and believe that resistance was possible would not be easy. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began. I know many of you have been dealing with HOA harassment for years. Some of you might be wondering why you should trust me since I've only been here 3 years. That's a fair question. Old Henry Martinez spoke up from his chair near the front. Because you're the first one who fought back and won, son. That mailbox of yours became a symbol around here. Showed us that maybe we don't have to keep taking this abuse. Several people nodded in agreement. Marcus took a breath and continued. Here's what I've discovered over the past few weeks. He walked to the table where he had laid out the documents and began explaining his findings. The selective enforcement against ranching families. The connection between the HOA board and Mountain Vista development. The systematic pattern of violations and fines designed to force property sales. As Marcus spoke, the room grew quieter. People leaned forward in their chairs. Faces that had looked tired now showed anger. Marcus played the video footage of his mailbox attack and explained about Greg Palmer and Kyle Morris. He showed the financial records proving money flowing between HOA accounts and companies owned by board members. He detailed how 7 families had already lost their properties to this scheme. They're trying to run us out, Carlos Rodriguez said when Marcus finished. They want our land so they can subdivide it and make millions. Yes, Marcus confirmed. But here's the thing about bullies. They rely on their victims being isolated and powerless. We're not going to be either anymore. Linda Cruz raised her hand like she was in school. What can we do, though? They have lawyers and control the HOA board. We're just individual property owners trying to survive. Marcus pulled out another document. This is the HOA charter and the Colorado state laws that govern homeowner associations. I've studied them carefully. The board has been violating their own rules in multiple ways. They're required to provide fair hearings for violations, but they've been rubber-stamping approvals without proper procedure. They're required to disclose conflicts of interest. But Gerald Hayes has never disclosed his family connection to Mountain Vista. They're required to enforce rules uniformly, but they've been targeting specific properties while ignoring violations in other areas. He paused to let that sink in. More importantly, Colorado law says that HOA rules must be reasonable as applied to each property. You cannot apply suburban mailbox standards to working ranch land. You cannot fine someone for keeping farm equipment on farm property. The law is actually on our side if we stand together and fight. Henry Martinez stood up slowly. What exactly are you proposing, Marcus? I'm proposing we form an alliance, Marcus said. Every ranching family that's being targeted by the HOA. We document every violation notice we receive. We attend HOA meetings together as a unified group. We support each other through the appeals process. We file formal complaints with the State Real Estate Commission. We make enough noise that Gerald Hayes and his corrupt board cannot ignore us or pick us off one by one. That sounds like a lot of work, someone said from the back. And it could make things worse. They might come after us even harder. They're already coming after you as hard as they can, Marcus replied. Linda is facing foreclosure right now. Carlos has $20,000 in fines. Henry has been fighting this for years. How much worse can it get before you lose everything anyway? The room was silent as people thought about that. Marcus could see them weighing the risks against doing nothing and losing their homes. I'll do it, Linda Cruz said suddenly. I'm too old to be scared anymore. If I'm going to lose my ranch, I'd rather lose it fighting than just give up. I'm in, Henry said. Been wanting to fight back for years, but I didn't think anyone would stand with me. One by one, others voiced their agreement. Not everyone was convinced. 2 families said they needed to think about it and left the meeting early. But 11 people representing 7 properties committed to joining the alliance. It was a start. Marcus spent the next hour outlining their strategy. He would use his technical skills to create a shared database for documenting violations and tracking appeals. Linda would file the formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission about the HOA's financial practices, since she had the most egregious example of improper enforcement. Henry would reach out to a lawyer he knew who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes to see if they could get legal advice. But most importantly, they would attend the next HOA meeting together. Not as isolated victims, but as an organized group demanding accountability. They would ask hard questions about the enforcement patterns and the financial relationships with Mountain Vista. They would make it clear that the days of easy intimidation were over. We need to be smart about this, Marcus warned. Gerald Hayes is not going to back down easily. He'll try to divide us or intimidate individual members. We have to maintain solidarity no matter what pressure they apply. Carlos raised a concern. What if they come after our properties even harder? What if they try to bankrupt us with fines? Then we stop paying the fines, Marcus said. All of us together. Force them to try foreclosing on 7 properties at once. That will draw attention and scrutiny they don't want. The State Real Estate Commission will investigate. The local newspaper will cover it. They're counting on us being too scared to fight back, but there's power in numbers. They talked for another hour, working out details and addressing concerns. Marcus gave everyone his phone number and email address. He set up a group chat so they could communicate quickly. He promised to share all his research and evidence with anyone who wanted it. By the time people started leaving, the mood had shifted from defeated to cautiously hopeful. Linda Cruz was the last to leave. She waited until the others had gone, then approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. Why are you doing this? You could just pay your fines or sell your property and move somewhere easier. You're not as invested here as the rest of us. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out over his land in the fading sunlight. My whole career I worked on projects that were supposed to protect people's rights and freedoms. Defense systems and security technology, all very important and classified. But it started to feel hollow after a while. What's the point of defending freedom in the abstract if you can't stand up for it in your own community? Linda nodded slowly. My husband used to say that good people doing nothing is how evil wins. Your husband was a wise man, Marcus said. After Linda left, Marcus walked around his property checking on his cattle. The evening was cold and clear with stars beginning to appear. His mailbox stood at the end of the driveway, white and colonial and completely undamaged. The symbol that Henry had mentioned. Marcus had not intended it that way, but he could see how people viewed it. One person refusing to be pushed around. One person saying no to bullies. But symbols were not enough. Real change required organization and sustained effort and willingness to take risks. Marcus had started something today that could not be taken back. The alliance was formed and Gerald Hayes would hear about it soon. Things were going to escalate from here. Marcus went inside and poured himself a bourbon. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop to review the evidence files one more time. Everything was documented and backed up in multiple locations. The video footage of Greg Palmer attacking his mailbox. The financial records showing the connection to Mountain Vista. The pattern of violations against ranching families. The proof of selective enforcement. He had enough to cause serious problems for Gerald Hayes and his corrupt board. The question was how to use it most effectively. Going public too soon might let them cover their tracks, but waiting too long might let them hurt more people like Linda. Timing would be everything. Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from the group chat. People sharing their own violation notices and comparing notes. The alliance was already starting to function. They were no longer isolated victims. They were becoming an organized resistance. Outside, the night settled over the ranch, quiet and peaceful. But Marcus knew the peace would not last. Gerald Hayes was not the type to accept defeat, and he would fight back hard when he realized what was happening. The real battle was just beginning. Marcus finished his bourbon and went to bed. He needed rest because the coming weeks would require all his energy and focus. He had engineered a solution to the mailbox problem. Now he needed to engineer a solution to the larger problem of corruption and abuse of power. It would be his most challenging project yet. Marcus Bennett walked down his gravel driveway on a cold Tuesday morning in November and found his mailbox destroyed again. The twisted metal lay scattered across the ground like someone had taken a baseball bat to it with pure rage. This was the 14th time in 8 months that someone had smashed his mailbox, and Marcus was tired of rebuilding it over and over. He stood there in his work boots and heavy jacket looking at the damage while his breath made little clouds in the freezing air. His coffee had gone cold in his hand, but he barely noticed because his mind was working through what he needed to do next. The ranch stretched out behind him for 100 acres of Colorado grassland where his cattle grazed peacefully in the early morning light. Marcus had bought this property 3 years ago when he retired from his career as an aerospace engineer. He had spent 30 years designing defense systems and working on classified projects that most people would never know about. All he wanted now was peace and quiet while he raised cattle and enjoyed the mountain views. But peace was the one thing he could not seem to find here in Meadowbrook Hills. The problem started when Marcus installed his first mailbox after moving in. He had chosen a sturdy steel mailbox painted black to match the ranch fencing. It looked good and it was practical, and Marcus thought nothing more about it. Then the letter came from the homeowners association. The letter said his mailbox violated the community covenants because it was not the approved colonial style with white paint and brass fixtures. Marcus read the letter twice because he could not believe what he was seeing. His property was a working ranch with cattle and pastures and barn buildings. It made no sense that suburban mailbox rules would apply here. He called the HOA office and spoke to a woman named Patricia Lane who served on the board. She explained that his property fell under HOA jurisdiction due to a boundary technicality from decades ago when the development expanded. The previous owner had never mentioned this to Marcus during the sale. Patricia said the rules were the rules and everyone had to follow them equally. Marcus tried to explain that ranch properties should be treated differently than suburban houses, but Patricia just repeated that the architectural standards applied to all properties without exception. Marcus ignored the first violation notice because it seemed too ridiculous to take seriously. Then the fines started coming. $50 for the first week of non-compliance, then $100, then $200. The amounts doubled every week according to some formula in the HOA bylaws. Marcus still refused to pay because he believed the rule was unjust and unreasonable. That was when his mailbox started getting destroyed. The first time it happened, Marcus thought it might be random vandalism. Teenagers maybe, or someone who had too much to drink. He filed a report with the sheriff's office and Deputy Frank Lloyd came out to take a look. Frank was a decent man who had lived in the area his whole life. He took photos and wrote up a report, but he did not sound hopeful about catching whoever did it. Marcus rebuilt the mailbox with a stronger model and better anchoring. 3 days later, it was destroyed again. By the fifth incident, Deputy Frank stopped being sympathetic. He suggested that Marcus should just comply with the HOA rules and avoid the trouble. Marcus asked if Frank was saying the vandalism was his own fault. Frank did not answer that question directly, but his meaning was clear enough. The law would not help Marcus with this problem. Marcus started asking around town about the HOA and its president, Gerald Hayes. What he learned was not encouraging. Gerald had been running the HOA for 12 years with an iron fist. He was a real estate broker who took the architectural standards very seriously. People said Gerald believed that strict enforcement kept property values high and the community desirable. But there were also whispers about Gerald's brother-in-law who owned a development company that had been buying up properties in the area. The ranching families in the community had their own stories about HOA harassment. Henry Martinez, who raised cattle on the property next to Marcus, said he had been fighting violations for years. The HOA fined him for keeping his work trucks visible from the road. They said his hay bales were unsightly. They complained about the smell of his livestock. Henry had paid thousands in fines over the years because he could not afford a legal battle. Other ranchers had similar tales of endless violations and mounting fines. Marcus tried the legal route next. He hired a lawyer who sent letters to the HOA arguing that the mailbox rules were unreasonable as applied to agricultural property. The HOA's lawyer sent letters back citing the covenants and the uniform enforcement policy. Marcus's lawyer said they could file a lawsuit, but it would cost tens of thousands of dollars and take years to resolve. Marcus had the money, but he was not sure he wanted to spend years in court over a mailbox. Meanwhile, the destruction continued. Every few weeks, Marcus would install a new mailbox, and every few weeks, someone would smash it. He tried different locations along his driveway. He tried different styles and materials. Nothing lasted more than a month. The worst part was knowing that someone was doing this deliberately to intimidate him. They wanted him to give up and fall in line, or maybe they wanted him to leave entirely. Marcus thought about selling the ranch and moving somewhere else. But that felt like surrender, and Marcus Bennett had never been good at surrendering. He had faced difficult problems his entire career and he had always found solutions. This was just another engineering challenge when you looked at it the right way. Someone was applying force to destroy his mailbox. He needed to design a mailbox that could not be destroyed and that would identify whoever tried. On the morning of the 14th destroyed mailbox, Marcus made his decision. He would build something special. He would use every skill he had learned in 30 years of aerospace engineering. He would create a mailbox that looked exactly like what the HOA wanted, but that could not be smashed no matter how hard someone tried. And he would make sure that whoever tried to destroy it would regret that decision. Marcus picked up the pieces of twisted metal and carried them to his workshop. The barn had been converted into a fully equipped engineering space with metalworking tools and computer equipment, and everything he needed. He threw the destroyed mailbox into a corner with all the others. Then he sat down at his computer and started designing something that would change everything. Marcus spent the entire next week in his workshop designing the perfect mailbox. He worked late into the night with technical drawings spread across his workbench and computer screens showing stress analysis calculations. His colleagues from his old aerospace job would have recognized the look of intense focus on his face. This was how Marcus solved problems, and this problem demanded an elegant solution that would accomplish multiple goals at once. The design had to meet several requirements. First, it needed to look exactly like the colonial-style mailbox that the HOA demanded. White-painted wood exterior with brass accents and even a decorative eagle on top. Nothing about the outside could give any hint of what lay beneath. Second, it needed to be absolutely indestructible by any method a vandal might use. Baseball bats and truck bumpers and whatever else they threw at it. Third, it needed to identify whoever attacked it in a way they would not notice until it was too late. The core structure would be a steel cylinder made from the same high-strength alloy used in aircraft landing gear. Marcus calculated that it could withstand impacts that would total a car without even denting. He designed the cylinder to be 8 inches in diameter and 4 feet tall. The bottom would extend 8 feet down into the ground, anchored by a massive concrete foundation with rebar extending in all directions like roots. Nothing short of a bulldozer would move it. The wooden exterior would be purely cosmetic. Marcus designed it as a shell that would break away when struck, but without causing injury to the attacker. The last thing he needed was a lawsuit from some idiot who hurt himself vandalizing property. The wood would splinter dramatically to make the attack feel successful, but the steel core underneath would remain completely untouched. The attacker would not realize what happened until the moment of impact. For the identification system, Marcus drew on technology he had worked with in defense applications. He installed motion sensors that could detect approaching vehicles and people. He added cameras with night vision and high resolution that could capture faces and license plates. He designed pressure sensors throughout the mailbox structure that would trigger when something struck it with sufficient force. All of this would feed into a small computer system hidden in the base. When the sensors detected an attack, the system would activate immediately. High-intensity LED lights would flash on bright enough to blind someone temporarily. A loud alarm would sound calibrated to be especially jarring at close range. The cameras would record everything and upload it instantly to cloud storage so the evidence could not be destroyed. Text alerts would go to Marcus's phone within seconds. But the real genius was the marking system. Marcus had worked on a classified project years ago that used ultraviolet reactive compounds for equipment tracking. He adapted that technology for his mailbox defense. The system would spray a fine mist of UV compound onto whatever struck the mailbox. The compound was completely invisible in normal light. You could not see it on skin or clothing or vehicle paint. But under ultraviolet light it glowed bright green, and it would last for weeks even with washing. Marcus ordered the materials he needed from various suppliers. The steel came from a metal fabrication shop in Denver. The sensors and cameras came from security equipment dealers. The UV compound required some creative sourcing through old contacts in the defense industry. Nobody asked too many questions because Marcus had a reputation and the right credentials. Within a week, everything arrived at his ranch. The installation took another full week of hard work. Marcus started by digging the foundation hole with a rented excavator, 8 feet down through Colorado soil and rock. He built a rebar cage that extended 4 feet in all directions from the central cylinder. Then he called a concrete truck and poured the foundation in one continuous pour. The concrete alone weighed over 3 tons, and that was before adding the steel and equipment. While the concrete cured, Marcus assembled the inner cylinder in his workshop. He welded the steel sections together with perfect seams that would never fail. He installed the sensor systems and ran all the wiring through waterproof conduits. He tested every component multiple times to make sure nothing would malfunction at the critical moment. The spray system got special attention because it had to deploy reliably, but also remain hidden and tamper-proof. The outer wooden shell was the last piece. Marcus built it to look exactly like the colonial mailboxes throughout Meadowbrook Hills. He studied photos of approved mailboxes and matched every detail. The white paint was the exact shade specified in the HOA architectural guidelines. The brass fixtures were polished to a mirror finish. The decorative eagle on top was identical to the one sold at the hardware store in town. Anyone looking at it would see a completely standard compliant mailbox. Marcus installed the finished mailbox on a cold Monday morning 2 weeks after finding the 14th destroyed one. He used the excavator to lower the steel cylinder into the foundation hole and then backfilled around it with more concrete. Once everything was set, he attached the wooden shell and made sure it would break away cleanly when struck. He tested all the sensors and cameras multiple times. He verified that the UV spray system worked perfectly and would coat anything within 3 feet of impact. The final mailbox looked peaceful standing at the end of his driveway. The white paint gleamed in the winter sunshine. The brass fixtures caught the light. The eagle seemed to watch over the property with dignity. Nobody driving past would suspect that this innocent-looking mailbox was actually a sophisticated defense system backed by 30 years of aerospace engineering experience. Marcus took photos from every angle and prepared a formal letter to Gerald Hayes and the HOA board. He explained that he had installed a new mailbox that met every requirement in the architectural guidelines. He included the photos showing the colonial style in white paint and brass fixtures. He cited the specific sections of the HOA covenants that his mailbox satisfied. His tone was professionally polite, but with an undertone that suggested he was done playing games. He sent the letter by certified mail so there would be proof of delivery. Then he went back to his house and set up the monitoring station in his study. Multiple screens showed the camera feeds from different angles. His phone was configured to receive instant alerts. The system was armed and ready. Now all Marcus had to do was wait for someone to take the bait. He did not have to wait long. Marcus knew the pattern of attacks. They usually happened within a week of installing a new mailbox. The vandals wanted to establish dominance quickly to show that resistance was futile. They would come soon, probably in the middle of the night when they thought nobody was watching. But this time Marcus would be watching and recording everything. This time the hunters would become the hunted. 3 nights after Marcus installed the new mailbox, his phone erupted with alerts at exactly 2:47 in the morning. He was already awake, sitting in his study with a cup of coffee, because some part of him had known this would be the night. The security monitors came alive, showing a dark pickup truck rolling slowly down his driveway with its headlights turned off. Marcus leaned forward, watching the screens with the calm focus of someone who had planned for exactly this moment. The truck moved carefully, trying to be quiet on the gravel. It stopped about 20 feet from the mailbox and the engine kept running. Marcus could see 2 figures inside through the night vision cameras. The passenger door opened and a man climbed out carrying what looked like an aluminum baseball bat. He was wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap pulled low, but the cameras were capturing everything in clear detail. The driver stayed in the truck, ready for a quick escape. This was clearly not their first time doing this. They had a system worked out from practice on Marcus's previous mailboxes. Get in fast and hit hard, then disappear before anyone noticed. It had worked 14 times before, and they had no reason to think tonight would be different. The man with the bat walked confidently toward the mailbox. He took a practice swing, cutting the air with a whooshing sound. Then he planted his feet and wound up for a full power strike aimed right at the middle of the mailbox. His body language showed complete certainty that this would be another easy destruction. The bat connected with the wooden shell at tremendous speed. For a fraction of a second, everything seemed to go as the attacker expected. The wood splintered and broke apart with a satisfying crack. But then the bat hit the steel core underneath and the entire situation changed in an instant. The sound was incredible. Metal striking metal with enormous force created a ringing clang that echoed across the ranch land like a church bell. The impact sent vibrations up through the bat so violent that the attacker nearly lost his grip. His arms jolted backward from the recoil, and his face showed pure shock as he realized something was very wrong. Then the defense systems activated all at once. The LED array blazed to life, flooding the area with blinding white light equivalent to a dozen car headlights. The attacker threw his arm up to shield his eyes and stumbled backward. The alarm began wailing, a harsh, penetrating sound that Marcus had specifically designed to be painful at close range, and the spray system deployed with a soft hiss, coating the attacker and the front quarter of the pickup truck with the invisible UV compound. The man dropped the bat and ran for the truck, yelling something Marcus could not hear over the alarm. The driver was already panicking, gunning the engine. The attacker dove into the passenger seat and the truck took off down the driveway, spraying gravel. They were going way too fast for the conditions, fishtailing as they turned onto the main road. Marcus saved all the video files to multiple locations. The cameras had captured excellent footage of both men, even with their attempts at concealment. The truck's license plate was partially visible in several frames. Most importantly, the spray system had worked perfectly, coating both the attacker and the vehicle with marking compound that would be invisible until Marcus chose to reveal it. He did not call Deputy Frank Lloyd, not yet anyway. Marcus wanted to see how this would play out first. The attackers did not know about the UV compound. They would think they had gotten away clean except for the surprise of hitting an indestructible mailbox. They would be confused and maybe a little scared, but they would not know how thoroughly they had been marked. Marcus made fresh coffee and watched the sky lighten with dawn. The mailbox stood undamaged at the end of his driveway with only some broken wood scattered around it. He would clean that up later. For now, he wanted to leave everything as evidence in case he needed it. Later that morning, Marcus drove into town with a small ultraviolet flashlight in his jacket pocket. His first stop was the hardware store where ranchers bought supplies. Several men stood near the paint section talking about winter preparations. Marcus browsed the tool aisle while watching them with peripheral vision. One man kept rubbing his forearms like they itched. When he reached up to grab something, from a high shelf his jacket rode up and Marcus caught a glimpse of his skin in the bright, fluorescent lights of the store. Marcus could just barely see a faint shimmer on the man's forearms. It was almost invisible, but Marcus knew what to look for. The UV compound had a distinctive appearance in certain lighting even without a blacklight. This man had definitely been sprayed by the mailbox defense system. Marcus did not recognize him immediately, but he made note of the face. The man was in his 40s with a construction worker build and a permanent sunburn. He bought some supplies and left driving a white work van. Marcus filed that information away and continued with his shopping. His next stop was the feed supply shop where he bought hay for his cattle. While talking to the owner about prices, Marcus noticed a dark blue pickup truck in the parking lot. It had a small dent in the hood and some damage to the front bumper that looked fresh. The truck's paint showed odd streaks near the damaged area, like someone had tried to wash off something that would not come off completely. Marcus walked past the truck on his way back to his own vehicle. He pulled out his phone and took a casual photo pretending to check messages. The license plate matched what he had seen in the security footage. This was definitely the truck from last night. The diner was his last stop. Marcus sat at the counter and ordered breakfast. The place was busy with the morning crowd of ranchers and workers. At a corner booth, Marcus spotted the man from the hardware store sitting with another man. They were talking in low voices and both looked tired, like they had not slept much. The second man was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in the working-class diner. Marcus recognized him now from HOA meetings. His name was Greg Palmer, and he served on the HOA Enforcement Committee. He owned a construction company in town and had been very vocal about maintaining community standards. Greg kept looking around nervously while he talked to the younger man. His hands moved constantly, adjusting his coffee cup or rubbing his face. When he lifted his coffee, both sleeves pulled back, and Marcus saw the shimmer on his wrists. Greg Palmer had been in that truck last night. One of the most prominent members of the HOA Enforcement Committee had personally vandalized Marcus's mailbox. Marcus finished his breakfast slowly while thinking through his next moves. He had all the evidence he needed to prove who attacked his property. Video footage and photographic documentation and physical evidence in the form of UV compound. But confronting them directly might not be the smartest approach. Better to let them wonder what he knew and watch them make mistakes. That afternoon, Marcus's phone rang. The caller ID showed Gerald Hayes calling from the HOA office. Marcus let it ring 3 times before answering. "Bennett, this is Gerald Hayes from the HOA board. I wanted to congratulate you on finally bringing your mailbox into compliance with community standards." Marcus smiled at the false warmth in Gerald's voice. "Thank you, Gerald. I appreciate you calling." "Yes, well, we believe in positive reinforcement when residents cooperate. I trust we won't have any further issues with your property." "I certainly hope not," Marcus said, keeping his tone casual, although I should mention that someone tried to vandalize my new mailbox the very first night after I installed it. There was a pause on the line. Marcus could almost hear Gerald's brain working. "Is that so? Well, that's unfortunate. Probably just teenagers or transients passing through." "Perhaps," Marcus said. "The interesting thing is I have excellent video footage of the incident. Very clear images. I also have some other evidence that's quite definitive. I'm still deciding what to do with it all." The pause was longer this time. When Gerald spoke again, his voice had lost the false warmth. "Now, Marcus, I hope you're not suggesting that anyone in our community would engage in vandalism. That would be a very serious accusation." "I'm not suggesting anything," Marcus replied. "I'm just stating facts. Someone attacked my mailbox. I have evidence. What I do with that evidence depends on what happens next." "I see," Gerald said coldly. "Well, I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding. These things have a way of working themselves out." Marcus ended the call and sat back in his chair. The message had been delivered. Now he would wait and see how they responded. 2 days after the phone call with Gerald Hayes, a formal letter arrived by certified mail from the HOA Legal Committee. Marcus opened it at his kitchen table while drinking his morning coffee. The letter was typed on expensive letterhead with multiple signatures at the bottom. It stated that the HOA board had conducted an administrative review of enforcement procedures regarding his property. After careful consideration, they were dropping all outstanding fines and violations related to his previous mailboxes. The letter made no mention of the vandalism or the phone conversation with Gerald. It was written as though the HOA was being generous rather than backing down. Marcus read the letter twice, then filed it carefully in his growing folder of HOA correspondence. This was progress, but he knew it was not over. Men like Gerald Hayes did not surrender easily, especially when their authority was challenged. The mailbox had been just one battle in a larger war. The real issue was that Marcus did not fit their vision of what the community should be, and they would keep trying to push him out. Over the next week, Marcus expanded his investigation. He spent hours in the county records office going through public documents, property transfers and HOA financial reports and building permits. He made careful notes and took photos with his phone. The clerk who helped him was a friendly woman named Betty, who had worked there for 30 years. She seemed pleased that someone was actually interested in the old records. What Marcus discovered was troubling. In the past 5 years, 7 ranching families had sold their properties after prolonged conflicts with the HOA. Each property had been quickly purchased by a company called Mountain Vista Development. The sales prices seemed low compared to the land values. Marcus traced Mountain Vista's ownership through multiple layers of shell companies until he found the name he was looking for. The CEO was a man named Roger Hayes, who happened to be Gerald Hayes' brother-in-law. The pattern became clear when Marcus mapped it out. A ranching family would start receiving excessive violations from the HOA, fines for minor issues or sometimes completely fabricated problems. The fines would accumulate with interest and penalties. Eventually, the family would either pay thousands of dollars or face foreclosure. Many chose to sell instead. Mountain Vista would buy the property and subdivide it into suburban lots that sold for much more than the original purchase price. Marcus spread printouts across his dining room table and connected the dots with a red marker. This was not just harassment about mailboxes or architectural standards. This was a systematic effort to convert ranching land into suburban development. The HOA was being used as a weapon to drive out the ranchers and consolidate property for Gerald's family business. His phone rang while he was studying the documents. The caller ID showed a number he did not recognize, but it was local. Marcus answered and heard an elderly woman's voice that shook slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Bennett, this is Linda Cruz. We haven't met, but I own the Small Horse Ranch about 2 miles from your property. I got your number from Henry Martinez. He said you might be able to help me." "What's wrong, Mrs. Cruz?" Marcus asked, sitting up straighter. "The HOA is threatening to foreclose on my property. They say I owe over $50,000 in unpaid fines and penalties. I can't afford that. My husband died 2 years ago, and I'm living on Social Security. They're saying I have to pay or they'll take my ranch." Marcus felt anger rise in his chest. "Don't sign anything, Mrs. Cruz. Don't agree to anything. I'm coming over right now." Linda Cruz's ranch was small but well maintained. The house was old but clean, and the barn looked solid. A few horses grazed in the pasture, looking healthy and content. Linda met Marcus at the door, looking tired and worried. She was in her 70s with white hair and hands worn from years of ranch work. They sat at her kitchen table, and Linda showed Marcus a stack of violation notices that had arrived over the past 2 years. Marcus read through them with growing disgust. Expired vehicle registration on a tractor that never left her property. Improper storage of hay bales visible from the road. Unapproved fence repairs using materials that did not match the architectural standards. Noise violations for her horses neighing in the early morning. The list went on and on. Each violation carried a fine that had been allowed to grow with late fees and interest. Linda had tried to contest some of them, but the HOA appeals process required written submissions and hearing attendance that she found overwhelming. She had paid what she could, but the amount kept growing faster than she could pay it down. "This is extortion," Marcus said flatly. "Half these violations are completely fabricated and the other half are so minor they shouldn't carry any fines at all." "But what can I do?" Linda asked with tears in her eyes. "I'm just one old woman against the whole HOA board. They have lawyers and money. I can't fight them." Marcus looked at the elderly woman and saw his own mother in her worried face. His mother had raised him alone after his father died, and had worked herself to exhaustion to give him opportunities. He could not stand by and watch someone like Linda lose everything to a corrupt system. "You're not alone, Mrs. Cruz," Marcus said firmly. "Not anymore." Over the next few days, Marcus reached out to other ranching families in the area. He called Henry Martinez first and explained what he had discovered about Mountain Vista development and the systematic targeting of ranchers. Henry was not surprised, but having documentation made it real in a new way. "I've been saying for years that something crooked was going on," Henry said over the phone, but nobody wanted to listen. The HOA kept saying they were just enforcing the rules equally. "Would you be willing to talk to the other ranchers?" Marcus asked. "Get them together for a meeting. I think if we all stand together, we might be able to stop this." Henry agreed and started making calls. Marcus continued his investigation, digging deeper into the HOA's financial records. The documents were public, but they were complex and buried in accounting jargon. Marcus had to read carefully to find the irregularities, money flowing between the HOA and various service companies that turned out to be owned by board members or their relatives, selective enforcement that coincidentally targeted properties in areas where Mountain Vista wanted to develop. Marcus also spent time with his UV flashlight checking around town for the marking compound. He found Greg Palmer's construction truck parked at a job site and confirmed the UV glow on the damaged areas. He spotted the younger man from the hardware store whose name turned out to be Kyle Morris working on a construction crew. Kyle's arm still showed faint traces of the compound even after a week of washing. The evidence was building into an overwhelming case. Marcus had video footage and financial documents and witness testimony and physical proof. But he needed more than just evidence. He needed a strategy to use it effectively. Going to the police would likely result in nothing, because Deputy Frank had already shown his unwillingness to help. Filing a lawsuit would take years and cost a fortune. The HOA could drag things out while continuing to harass the ranchers. No, Marcus needed something that would force quick action and public accountability. He needed to unite the ranchers and make enough noise that Gerald Hayes and his corrupt board could not ignore them or intimidate them into silence. He needed to turn the victims into an organized resistance. On Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after his mailbox trap, Marcus stood in his barn waiting for the ranchers to arrive. He had set up folding chairs on the concrete floor and laid out the evidence on tables. His laptop was ready with the video footage queued up. The barn doors were open, letting in the cold winter air and the afternoon sunlight. People started arriving in trucks and old cars. Henry Martinez came first and helped arrange the chairs. Linda Cruz arrived with her neighbor Carlos Rodriguez, who raised sheep. Others followed until 15 people filled the barn, representing 9 different ranching families. They sat on the chairs or leaned against the walls, talking quietly among themselves. Everyone looked tired and worried, but also curious about why Marcus had called this meeting. Marcus stood at the front and waited until everyone was settled. Then he began to speak. Marcus spent the next 3 weeks digging deeper into the HOA's operations, while the Rancher Alliance organized itself. Every morning he would check the group chat to find new messages from members sharing violation notices or asking questions about their rights. Linda Cruz had filed her formal complaint with the State Real Estate Commission and received confirmation that they were opening an investigation. Henry Martinez had connected them with a lawyer named Paul Sherman, who agreed to provide consultation at reduced rates for the group. But what Marcus discovered during his investigation was far more disturbing than even he had anticipated. The pattern of corruption went back almost a decade and involved more people than just Gerald Hayes and Greg Palmer. The entire enforcement system had been weaponized to serve financial interests rather than community welfare. Marcus created a detailed timeline on his computer, tracking every property that had been targeted by the HOA over the past 10 years. He cross-referenced violation notices with property sales and Mountain Vista development acquisitions. The pattern was unmistakable. Properties would receive a sudden spike in violations all at once. Things that had been ignored for years would suddenly become urgent problems requiring immediate correction and substantial fines. The targeted property owners would try to comply, but the violations would keep coming. Repairs they made would be deemed inadequate. New issues would be discovered. The fines would multiply with interest and late penalties. Eventually, most owners would either pay tens of thousands of dollars or sell their property at below market value. Mountain Vista would purchase the land within weeks of the sale being finalized. Marcus found 7 confirmed cases following this exact pattern. But as he dug deeper, he found evidence suggesting 3 more properties were currently in the early stages of the same process. Carlos Rodriguez was one of them. His sheep ranch had been hit with a wave of new violations in the past month. Another was a family named the Watkins who owned 40 acres with apple orchards. The third was an elderly man named Pete Sullivan who raised goats. Marcus called an emergency meeting of the Alliance to share what he had found. They gathered in his barn again on a cold Tuesday evening. This time there were 18 people, including the Watkins family and Pete Sullivan, who had heard about the Alliance through Henry Martinez. "I need to show you something," Marcus said after everyone had settled. He had set up a projector connected to his laptop. The barn wall served as a screen. Marcus displayed his timeline with all the targeted properties marked in red. "This is every property that has been forced out over the past decade," Marcus explained. "Notice the pattern. They all went through the same sequence of events. Sudden increase in violations, accumulating fines, eventual sale to Mountain Vista Development." He zoomed in on 3 properties marked in orange. "These are properties currently being targeted using the same playbook. Carlos, you're here on this list. The Watkins family is here. Pete Sullivan is here. If we do nothing, all 3 of you will lose your properties within the next year." The room erupted in angry voices, people shouting questions and accusations. Marcus waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "There's more," he said. "I've been analyzing the HOA's financial records going back 5 years. Remember, these are public documents that anyone can request. What I found is a web of financial connections between board members and various service companies that the HOA uses." Marcus displayed a chart showing money flows between accounts. The HOA pays a company called Summit Property Management to handle enforcement and inspections. Summit Property Management is owned by Greg Palmer, who sits on the HOA Enforcement Committee. The HOA pays another company called Hayes Real Estate Services for property valuations. That company is owned by Gerald Hayes himself. He clicked to another screen. The HOA pays inflated prices for these services compared to market rates. The excess money flows back to the board members. Then when properties are forced into sale, Mountain Vista buys them using financing from a bank where Patricia Lane, who also serves on the HOA board, happens to be a vice president. "That's fraud," Linda Cruz said. "That's criminal." "Yes, it is," Marcus agreed. "But it's been carefully structured to look legitimate on the surface. They file the proper paperwork. They maintain the appearance of arm's-length transactions. You need to dig deep to see the connections." Paul Sherman, the lawyer, stood up. He was a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "This is excellent work, Marcus. With this documentation, we have grounds for legal action. But I need to warn everyone that fighting this will be difficult and potentially expensive." "What are our options?" Henry Martinez asked. Paul counted on his fingers. "First option is a civil lawsuit against the HOA board for breach of fiduciary duty and fraud. That could take years and cost significant money even at my reduced rates. Second option is filing criminal complaints with the district attorney's office. That's free, but there's no guarantee they'll prosecute. Third option is going public through the media and hoping the publicity forces action." "We need to do all 3, Marcus said. "File the lawsuit to put legal pressure on them. File criminal complaints to get law enforcement involved. And go public to create accountability through community awareness." Not everyone agreed with that approach. Some people worried about the cost and risk. A few were concerned about retaliation from the HOA board. But after heated discussion, the group voted to move forward with Marcus's plan. They would pool resources to fund the lawsuit. They would coordinate their criminal complaints through Paul Sherman. and they would reach out to the local newspaper to tell their story. Over the next week, Marcus worked with Paul Sherman to prepare the legal documents. The lawsuit named Gerald Hayes and the other board members personally, along with the HOA itself. It alleged breach of fiduciary duty and fraud in violation of Colorado HOA statutes. It sought to void all fines against the plaintiff properties and recover damages for the families who had been forced to sell. Linda Cruz filed her criminal complaint with detailed documentation of the foreclosure threat and the pattern of violations. Carlos Rodriguez filed a complaint about the targeting of his property. 3 of the families who had been forced to sell were located and agreed to file complaints about the coerced sales. Marcus reached out to the local newspaper and spoke with a reporter named Amy Chen who covered community issues. She was immediately interested in the story. Marcus provided her with copies of all his documentation, including the financial analysis and the timeline of targeted properties. Amy promised to investigate thoroughly before running any story. While all this legal and media activity was happening, Marcus continued monitoring Greg Palmer and Kyle Morris. The UV marking compound had faded, but Marcus had their identities and vehicle information documented. More importantly, he had the video evidence of them attacking his mailbox. He was saving that for the right moment. Gerald Hayes must have heard about the alliance and the lawsuit preparation, because Marcus received a phone call from him on a Friday afternoon. Gerald's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Bennett, you're making a serious mistake. Filing frivolous lawsuits against the HOA board, spreading false accusations about corruption. This could have legal consequences for you." "I'm not spreading false accusations, Gerald," Marcus replied calmly. "Everything I've documented is factual and supported by evidence. If you believe my lawsuit is frivolous, you're welcome to make that argument to a judge." "You think you're smart, don't you?" Gerald said. "You come into our community and cause trouble. You get the other ranchers riled up with conspiracy theories, but you don't understand how things work here." "I understand exactly how things work," Marcus said. "You've been using the HOA to drive out ranching families so your brother-in-law can buy their land cheap. You've been enriching yourself and the board members through inflated service contracts. You've been violating your fiduciary duties and probably several criminal statutes." There was a long silence on the line. When Gerald spoke again, his voice was cold. "You can't prove any of that?" "Actually, I can," Marcus said. "I have financial records and property transfer documents and witness testimony. I have video evidence of your enforcement committee members vandalizing property. I have enough proof to bury you, Gerald. The only question is whether you want to settle this quietly or have it all come out in court and in the newspaper." "This isn't over, Bennett," Gerald said and hung up. Marcus sat at his desk thinking about the call. Gerald was scared, and scared people made mistakes. The pressure was building and something would break soon. Marcus just needed to be ready when it did. That evening, Marcus received a text message from Amy Chen, the reporter. She had completed her investigation and was planning to run a front-page story in Sunday's newspaper. She wanted to give the HOA board a chance to comment before publication. Marcus smiled as he read the message. The publicity would change everything. He walked down to check his mailbox in the gathering darkness. The white colonial structure stood unchanged at the end of his driveway. Marcus ran his hand along the wooden exterior, thinking about everything that had happened since he built it. The mailbox had been a symbol of resistance, but now the resistance was becoming something larger. The newspaper story hit like a bomb on Sunday morning. Amy Chen had written a comprehensive investigation, spread across the front page with a headline that read, "HOA accused of systematic fraud against ranching families." The article detailed everything Marcus had discovered, including the financial connections to Mountain Vista Development and the pattern of targeted enforcement. It featured interviews with Linda Cruz and the Watkins family and quotes from Paul Sherman about the legal violations. Marcus's phone started ringing at 7 in the morning with calls from Alliance members who had seen the story. By noon, the article had been shared hundreds of times on social media. Local television stations picked up the story for their evening news broadcasts. The community was divided sharply, with some people defending the HOA board and others expressing outrage at the revelations. Gerald Hayes issued a statement through the HOA's lawyer, claiming the allegations were completely false and motivated by property owners who refused to follow reasonable community standards. He said the board had acted appropriately in all cases and looked forward to defending their actions in court. But his statement sounded defensive and did not address the specific financial connections Amy Chen had documented. The State Real Estate Commission announced they were expanding their investigation to include possible criminal violations. The district attorney's office confirmed they were reviewing the criminal complaints that had been filed. Mountain Vista Development issued a terse statement, saying they had purchased properties through legitimate market transactions and denied any improper coordination with the HOA. Board Marcus spent Sunday afternoon fielding calls and responding to messages. Several more families reached out wanting to join the alliance after reading the newspaper story. Some shared their own experiences with HOA harassment that they had been too intimidated to speak about before. The movement was growing beyond what Marcus had initially imagined. On Monday morning, Marcus received an unexpected call from Patricia Lane, who served on the HOA board. She sounded nervous and spoke quickly. "Mr. Bennett, I need to talk to you confidentially. Not as a board member, but as someone who made mistakes and wants to make them right." Marcus was immediately suspicious, but agreed to meet her at a coffee shop in town. Patricia was waiting when he arrived, looking tired and worried. She was in her 50s with professionally styled hair and expensive clothes. She had always presented herself as a defender of community standards, but now she looked like someone carrying a heavy burden. "Thank you for meeting me," Patricia said as Marcus sat down. "I know you have no reason to trust me. I've been part of the board that's been doing terrible things to your community." "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because I'm done lying," Patricia said. "I didn't realize what Gerald was doing at first. I thought we were just enforcing the rules fairly. But over time I started noticing the patterns you documented, the way certain properties got targeted while others were ignored, the financial arrangements that benefited board members." She pulled out a folder and slid it across the table to Marcus. "These are internal board documents. Meeting minutes where we discuss targeting specific properties. Emails between Gerald and his brother-in-law about which properties to acquire. Financial records showing how the service contracts were structured to funnel money back to board members." Marcus opened the folder and quickly scanned the documents. This was exactly the kind of internal evidence that would be devastating in court. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because what we did was wrong," Patricia said simply. "Families lost their homes because of our greed. Linda Cruz is facing foreclosure because I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. I can't undo the damage, but I can help stop it from continuing." "You realize this will implicate you as well," Marcus said. "You could face criminal charges." "I know," Patricia said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer about immunity in exchange for testimony. But even if I don't get immunity, I'm prepared to accept the consequences. Some things are more important than protecting yourself." Marcus studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but saw only genuine regret. "What made you change your mind?" "I have grandchildren," Patricia said. "One of them asked me about the newspaper story. She wanted to know if what they were saying about the HOA was true. I couldn't look her in the eye and lie. I couldn't be the kind of person who hurts families to make money." They talked for another hour, with Patricia explaining the internal workings of the board's corruption. She confirmed that Gerald Hayes had been the driving force behind the scheme. Greg Palmer and several other board members had participated willingly in exchange for financial benefits. Some board members, like Patricia, had gone along without fully understanding the extent of the fraud until it was too late. Marcus took the documents and promised to share them with Paul Sherman and the district attorney's office. Patricia agreed to testify if the case went to trial. She also agreed to resign from the board immediately and make a public statement about what had been happening. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and Marcus knew it would be contentious. The Alliance organized a large turnout with over 50 people planning to attend. They prepared questions and statements designed to put maximum pressure on the remaining board members. Thursday evening, the community center was packed beyond capacity. People lined the walls and crowded the doorway. Television cameras set up in the back. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Gerald Hayes called the meeting to order. He looked haggard and angry as he banged his gavel, trying to establish control. "This meeting will come to order," Gerald announced. "We have a full agenda tonight, and I expect everyone to conduct themselves appropriately." Henry Martinez stood up immediately. "I have a question about the agenda, Gerald. Why isn't the systematic fraud and corruption by this board listed as an item for discussion?" The room erupted in applause and shouting. Gerald banged his gavel repeatedly. That is not an appropriate comment. We are here to conduct HOA business, not respond to baseless accusations. They're not baseless, Marcus said, standing up. We have documentation of everything. Financial records showing the connections to Mountain Vista development, meeting minutes discussing property targeting, testimony from a sitting board member confirming the corruption. Gerald's face turned red. You have nothing but conspiracy theories and lies. This board has acted with complete integrity. Then explain why Patricia Lane resigned this morning and released a statement confirming everything we've alleged, Marcus said.
Explain why the district attorney is investigating.
Explain why 7 families lost their properties following the exact same pattern of harassment. The crowd erupted again with people shouting questions and demands. Other board members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Gerald tried to maintain control, but the meeting descended into chaos. People demanded his resignation. Television cameras captured everything. Finally, Gerald stood up and slammed his gavel one final time. This meeting is adjourned. We will reschedule when people can behave civilly. You can't just adjourn the meeting, Linda Cruz called out. We have the right to speak about HOA business. The meeting is over, Gerald said and walked out through a side door. The other board members followed quickly except for one man named Richard Porter, who stayed behind looking troubled. Richard approached Marcus after most people had left. I need to talk to you. I didn't know the extent of what Gerald was doing. I thought we were just maintaining standards. But after reading the newspaper story and Patricia's statement, I realized I was either blind or willfully ignorant. Marcus listened as Richard explained his position. He had been on the board for 3 years and had trusted Gerald's leadership without asking hard questions. He admitted that he had voted for enforcement actions without reviewing the details. He agreed to resign from the board and cooperate with the investigation. Over the next week, 3 more board members resigned as the pressure mounted. Only Gerald Hayes and Greg Palmer remained along with one other member, who still insisted everything had been legitimate. The HOA was functionally paralyzed with resignations and investigations preventing normal operations. The district attorney announced formal charges against Gerald Hayes and Greg Palmer for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Roger Hayes from Mountain Vista Development was charged with conspiracy. The State Real Estate Commission suspended the HOA's authority to levy new fines pending the investigation. Marcus received a call from Gerald's lawyer proposing a settlement. They offered to drop all fines against the Alliance properties and resign from the board in exchange for the civil lawsuit being dismissed. Marcus took the offer to the Alliance for discussion. It's not enough, Linda Cruz said firmly. They need to compensate the families who lost their properties. They need to admit what they did publicly, and they need to face criminal consequences. The group agreed unanimously. Marcus called the lawyer back and rejected the settlement offer. They would see this through to the end regardless of how long it took. The media coverage continued with investigative reports appearing in newspapers across Colorado. A state legislator announced plans to introduce reforms to HOA regulations to prevent similar abuses.